The sky over Normandy that day was painted in shades of orange and black. August 14th, 1944, and Ernst Weber felt his Focke-Wulf 190 dying beneath him. The fighter had taken flak, serious flak, and now the machine was coming apart. Metal shrieked as pieces tore away. Oil sprayed across his canopy in dark patterns. The temperature gauge was climbing toward catastrophe. He'd been flying combat for nearly 2 years. He knew every vibration this aircraft could make, every sound that meant something was wrong. But nothing had prepared him for this particular silence that comes right before everything stops working. The engine coughed. Smoke began filling the cockpit, thick and choking. 30 seconds, maybe less. That's what his training told him. Get her down, find a field, any field will do. His hands moved through the procedures automatically, muscle memory taking over when his mind wanted nothing more than to surrender to terror. Below him stretched the Normandy countryside, a patchwork quilt of green and brown fields divided by ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries. Those walls looked so solid from up here, so permanent. He picked a field that wasn't ideal but would have to serve. The impact came with a violence that no film could capture. This wasn't some Hollywood explosion with dramatic flames lighting up the sky. This was the sickening crunch of metal failing, the airframe tearing itself to pieces around him. His body slammed forward against the harness with enough force to crack ribs. His head snapped back, then forward again. Blood filled his mouth, tasting of copper and fuel. The world grayed out at the edges. Sound became a high-pitched ringing that seemed to come from inside his skull. For a moment, maybe several moments, he couldn't tell anymore. There was only that ringing and the terrible finality of it. He thought about his brother Dieter, frozen on the Eastern Front, pulled from wreckage that would never be found. At least Ernst would die like a soldier. At least his mother would get a letter saying he'd fought to the end. Then the voices came. English, American English, urgent and rough and very much alive. Hands grabbed his harness, not gentle because there wasn't time for gentleness, but purposeful and strong. Someone was shouting that he was still in the cockpit, that they needed to move him now before the fuel tank went. Ernst tried to resist. Some part of his training, some voice from the Hitler Youth days told him he should fight. But his body wouldn't obey. His arms hung limp at his sides. His legs refused to move. They dragged him across torn earth and splintered wood, his boots carving trails through the mud. He smelled grass and diesel fuel mixed with the overwhelming stench of his own fear. 20 meters, maybe 30. Then one of the Americans threw himself across Ernst's body, shielding him with his own frame. The world turned orange. The fuel tank ruptured with a dull whomp that he felt reverberate through his chest. Heat washed over them in a suffocating wave. Debris pattered down like rain. When Ernst opened his eyes, a young American private was staring down at him, breathing hard, his face still soft around the edges, eyes wide with adrenaline. The kid couldn't have been more than 19. His uniform smelled of smoke and sweat. Jesus, the private said, that was close. Ernst stared up at him, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. They'd pulled him from a burning plane. They'd thrown themselves over him to shield him from the explosion. This violated everything he'd been taught since age 12, since he first put on the uniform his mother had sewn with such pride. More soldiers gathered around him. One wore a medic's armband, an older man with a face weathered by too many days in the field. He knelt beside Ernst and asked if he could hear him. When Ernst didn't respond, the medic switched to German, his accent thick but his words clear. "Can you hear me?" Ernst managed a nod. His throat felt raw, he tasted blood and smoke. The medic's hands moved over him with surprising gentleness, checking for breaks, for bleeding, for the invisible injuries that killed men hours after they thought they were safe. His touch was professional but never rough. There was no mockery in his eyes, no hatred, just focus, just the careful attention of someone who had done this too many times before. The young private handed Ernst a canteen. "Here," he said, "drink." Ernst's hands shook as he took it. The water was clean and cool. It washed the taste of blood from his mouth. It shouldn't have mattered so much. It was just water. But it did matter, more than he could explain. Ernst had been prepared for brutality. His entire military education had prepared him for this. American soldiers were barbarous, without honor, the propaganda films had shown him clearly. They would beat prisoners, starve them, mock them without regard for the conventions of war. He had braced himself for it, steeled himself for it during the drive to the processing center in northern France. Instead, he got paperwork. The processing center was a cluster of canvas tents surrounded by barbed wire, arranged with the kind of efficiency that felt almost absurd. A sergeant with a clipboard asked for his name, rank, and serial number. Ernst gave them, his voice hoarse, and the sergeant wrote them down without comment, without sneering, as though Ernst were simply another administrative task to be completed before moving on to the next one. Then came the medical examination. A doctor whose hands were steady as he checked Ernst's burns, taped his ribs, and gave him 2 white pills with another cup of water. They issued him clean clothes, used certainly but properly mended. The shirt smelled faintly of lye soap. The trousers were too long but serviceable. They led him to a tent with rows of cots, thin mattresses on metal frames, and told him in broken German this was where he would sleep. There were perhaps 30 other German prisoners there. Young pilots like himself, Wehrmacht soldiers still caked with mud from the hedgerows, and 2 sailors who looked profoundly out of place so far from any ocean. No one was bleeding, no one bore the marks of a beating. The men sat on their cots or stood in small clusters, talking in low voices. The atmosphere wasn't one of terror, but of exhausted confusion. Ernst found an empty cot and sat down carefully, his ribs screaming with each breath. A guard walked past, maybe 20 years old, with red hair and freckles, and simply nodded at him, just a nod, as though they were passing each other on a street somewhere, as though there were no war, no uniforms, no reason for enmity. At dinner they received rations, not lavish but regular, coffee that was weak but hot, bread that was a day old but filling, tinned meat that Ernst couldn't identify, but ate anyway because his body was screaming for fuel. He sat at a long wooden table with other prisoners and ate in silence, watching the Americans move about their duties with casual efficiency. One guard, a sergeant with a thick mustache, walked by and said something in broken German that Ernst thought might have been a joke about planes. A sailor at the end of the table laughed. Ernst didn't. He couldn't. The cognitive dissonance was too great. This was a cage, yes, but it was a cage with rules, with order, with a strange bureaucratic fairness that felt more threatening than violence would have been. Violence, after all, he could understand. But this measured treatment, this respect for procedure and regulation, this was something else entirely. That evening, another pilot arrived, a Berliner named Klaus with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. He took the cot next to Ernst's and immediately began holding court, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't be fooled," he told the men gathered around him. "This is theater. They want us docile and compliant. Wait until they ship us to the camps in America. Then you'll see what they're really like." Ernst wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to believe him, would have confirmed what he'd been taught, would have made sense of the world as he understood it. But then Kowalski, the medic whose name patch Ernst had noticed earlier, appeared with an extra blanket and handed it to him without ceremony. "You get cold," Kowalski said in his accented German. Nothing more, no speech about mercy or decency, just a blanket and a simple statement of fact. Ernst took it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it across his cot. It was wool, worn thin in places, but still warm. He stared at it for a long time after Kowalski had moved on to check on other prisoners. Klaus watched him with cynical amusement. "See," he said, "theater." But Ernst wasn't sure anymore. Because the blanket was real. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the simple fact that someone had noticed he might be cold, all of that was real. That night, when the August darkness brought an unseasonable chill, Ernst pulled the blanket up to his chin. He dreamed of Dieter, frozen on the Eastern Front. No blankets, no medics with accented German, no one to notice if he was cold. He woke with tears on his face and didn't know if he was crying for Dieter or for himself or for the terrible, incomprehensible kindness of enemies who should have been monsters. They shipped him to England in early September, packed into the hold of a transport ship with 200 other prisoners. The crossing was rough and many of the men were sick, but Ernst stood at the small porthole and watched the French coast disappear into grey mist. He wondered if he would ever see the continent again. He wondered if there would be anything left to see. The camp in England was larger than the processing centre, more permanent, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences and watchtowers. But like the processing centre, it was orderly, almost boring in its routine. Roll call at dawn, the prisoners standing in straight lines, while a sergeant with a clipboard counted them like inventory. Work details after breakfast, sorting supplies in warehouses, light maintenance on equipment, tasks that felt more like busy work than punishment. Evening recreation in a common area where men played cards with dog-eared decks or listened to a harmonica someone had somehow smuggled in. It was during the work details that Ernst first really spoke with Private James Hutchins. Jimmy, the other prisoners, called him, though Ernst didn't understand why Americans were so casual with names. Jimmy was the Iowa farm boy who had been there the day of the crash, the one with the wide eyes and the canteen of water. Now he had been assigned to supervise their supply detail, which seemed to mostly involve standing around and making sure no one stole anything. Jimmy talked constantly. It was as though silence made him nervous, so he filled every quiet moment with words, with stories about his family back home, about the farm and the weather and his sister's wedding he'd missed, about anything and everything except the war itself. His stories spilled out like treasures he was sharing after years of holding them close. He spoke of his mother's pies, apple, cherry, rhubarb, arriving with the spring, the way someone might speak of miracles. He painted pictures of his dog, a companion who had shadowed his every step through boyhood, following him across fields and down country roads as faithfully as a shadow follows the sun. The farm lived in his words, morning chores before dawn, the rich, deep smell of hay stacked in the barn. He talked about missing that flat horizon, truly flat, unbroken by hedgerows or the jagged wreckage of bombed-out buildings. Something about his voice carried genuine longing, the homesickness of a man who belonged to soil and seasons. Ernst mostly listened. There wasn't much else to do, and truth be told, Jimmy's voice had a quality that soothed something wound too tight inside him. Here was a man whose biggest worry before all this had been the corn crop and whether frost would come too early. Someone who'd never wanted to be a soldier at all, wearing his uniform like a boy drowning in his father's suit. Too big, all wrong, uncomfortable in every way. One afternoon, while they were sorting through crates of medical supplies, Jimmy stopped moving. He turned directly to Ernst, his expression curious and open. "You got family somewhere?" Ernst's hands froze on the bandages he was counting. The question felt unsafe somehow, too direct, too human, in a world where humanity got you killed. But Jimmy's face held no cruelty, no trap, just genuine wanting to know. "A mother," Ernst said finally. "In Dusseldorf. My father died when I was young. My brother too." He paused. Russia took him. Jimmy went quiet in a way that was almost merciful. "I'm sorry," Ernst heard himself say, then immediately regretted it. "Why?" Ernst asked sharply. "He was your enemy." Jimmy's shrug came so casual it almost felt disrespectful. "But he was a brother first, wasn't he?" The word struck Ernst with unexpected force. He returned to the bandages, counting them again, though he'd already counted twice, 3 times. He needed to count something. Jimmy didn't press further. He simply started talking about his own brother back home, running the family farm now, and Ernst felt grateful for the sound of another voice, filling the space where his grief lived and breathed. 3 weeks into his captivity, a mail call came on Thursday. Ernst stood with the other prisoners, not really expecting anything, but unable to stop that small flicker of hope that rises despite itself. When the sergeant called his name, his hands began shaking before he even reached for the envelope. He waited until evening, until he was alone on his bunk, before opening it. His mother's handwriting, careful, precise, exactly as he remembered, the script she'd learned as a young girl and never abandoned, even as the world collapsed around her. "Ernst, my boy," it began. "The bombs came again last week. The factory district is gone. I am staying with Frau Miller now. She lost her son too. We share what we have. The radio says we are winning. But Ernst, I do not believe them anymore. Your letters keep me alive. Please, if you can, come home. I don't care how, I just want you safe. "With love, Mother." He read it 3 times, then a fourth. The paper trembled in his hands. His mother, who had waved him off to flight school with such pride, who had believed every official word, who had sewn his uniforms and pressed his medals and kept his photograph on the mantel, was living in ruins now. The prosperity they'd been promised had become ash. The victory they'd been guaranteed was nothing but lies broadcast over rubble. And here he was, fed, safe, while she might not be by the time this very letter crossed the channel back to Germany. Winter came early that year, or maybe Ernst just felt it more keenly. By November, the camp had settled into something almost like routine. Guards knew prisoners by name. Prisoners knew which guards would look away for an extra minute during recreation time. There were rhythms, small mercies that accumulated into something resembling life. A shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived mid-November: Swiss chocolate, American cigarettes, wool socks so thick they felt like luxury after months of rationed necessities. Ernst received his and stared at it before opening. Inside was chocolate, cigarettes he couldn't smoke, and socks that felt decadent. He ate half the chocolate that first night and saved the rest. The cigarettes he traded to Klaus for a battered copy of Goethe someone had smuggled in from somewhere. Life found its rhythm. Ernst even laughed now, cautiously and quietly, when Jimmy told jokes that didn't quite translate, but were funny in their earnestness anyway. He wrote letters to his mother, censored and stripped of anything real. But he wrote them because the act of writing felt like keeping her alive. He helped younger prisoners with English, boys barely out of boyhood struggling over pronunciation with the determination of men who knew language meant survival. Things were as good as they could be, a prisoner in a foreign country, while your homeland crumbled around your mother. Ernst had begun thinking this was how his war would end, in this strange limbo of captivity that was somehow more humane than freedom had ever been. Then the November mail arrived, and everything changed. Thursday roll call. The sergeant called his name. He took the envelope and knew instantly something was wrong. The handwriting wasn't his mother's. It was unfamiliar, shaky. The script of someone unaccustomed to writing letters. He opened it there in the yard, unable to wait, unable to breathe. "Dear Hauptmann Weber," it began. "It is my painful duty to inform you that your mother passed away on October 21st. The bombing was sudden. The cellar collapsed. She did not suffer long. She spoke of you at the end. She was proud. She said, 'At least Ernst is safe.'" He read the words once. His vision blurred. The paper shook in his hands, or perhaps his hands were shaking and the paper remained still. He couldn't tell. Around him, other prisoners opened their letters, talked, laughed, lived. The sounds reached him as though from very far away, muffled and distorted. He walked to his bunk and sat down and stared at nothing. Klaus tried to speak to him. Other prisoners offered awkward condolences in the way of men who'd learned death was too common to acknowledge. Ernst nodded, or thought he did, but he wasn't really there anymore. He was in a cellar in Dusseldorf, watching the ceiling come down. Unable to help. Unable to be there. Unable to do anything but survive while his mother died, believing her son was safe. That night, long after lights out, Ernst left the barracks. No one stopped him. The guards had learned which prisoners were escape risks and which simply needed to breathe. He walked to the edge of the fence and stood in the November cold with his arms wrapped around himself. Kowalski appeared beside him. The medic who moved through the camp with quiet efficiency. He didn't ask what was wrong. He'd seen the mail call. He understood, and finally, Ernst broke. The sobs came from somewhere deep, a place locked shut since he was 10, and his father died, since his mother told him that men don't cry. They were ugly, gasping sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for his mother, for his brother, for every lie he'd believed, for every person he couldn't save. Kowalski simply stood there, a quiet presence in the dark, and let Ernst shatter completely. The weeks after were grey. Not the grey of weather, though December brought cold rain that turned the camp into mud. But the grey of existence itself, without colour, without texture, without meaning. Ernst went through motions because there was nothing else. Roll call, work details, rations, sleep, but he wasn't really present for any of it. Kowalski checked on him frequently during those weeks, never obviously concerned, just stopping by during his rounds to ask if Ernst needed anything. Ernst always said no. What could possibly matter anymore? But Kowalski kept coming anyway, and there was something steadying about his presence, about the way he treated grief as simply another injury requiring attention and time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ernst began noticing things again. Small things. A young guard named Peter teaching himself English with determined focus, mouthing words during recreation time, Jimmy still telling his terrible jokes and talking about his mother's pies. Kowalski moving through the camp, checking wounds, distributing medicine, sitting with broken men in ways that had nothing to do with bandages. One evening in late December, Ernst found himself in the common area watching Kowalski play gin rummy with 3 other prisoners. Kowalski was winning with smug satisfaction. Ernst sat down at the edge of the group, not playing but present, and realized something about the normalcy of it all. Men arguing over rules, laughing at bad hands, meant life continued even when you thought it couldn't possibly. After the game, Ernst approached Kowalski sitting alone near the stove, a letter in his hands. "Can I ask you something?" Ernst said carefully in English. Kowalski gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sure, kid." Ernst sat. For a moment the words wouldn't come in English, so he spoke in German, hoping Kowalski would understand. "Why do you do this? Why do you care what happens to us?" Kowalski was quiet for a long time, eyes still on his letter. Then he folded it carefully and met Ernst's gaze. "My dad came to America from Poland," he said slowly, using simple words Ernst could follow. "He died when I was 16. Factory accident. No one cared. But one guy did, a foreman named Mr. Chen, Chinese man who barely spoke English himself. He got my mom a job, paid for my dad's funeral. Didn't have to, but he did." Kowalski paused. It mattered, changed everything for us. He met Ernst's eyes. Small kindnesses change big lives. I figure the world needs more of that, especially now. Ernst nodded slowly, feeling something shift in the frozen place where his heart had been. A small thaw. "Can I write a letter?" he asked. "Not to Germany, to Frau Miller, the woman who wrote to tell me about my mother." Kowalski smiled. "Yeah, I'll make sure it gets through." Ernst wrote that night by dim barracks light, choosing each word with care. He thanked Frau Miller for caring for his mother. He said he was alive and treated well. Then, because it mattered, because someone needed to hear the truth, he wrote, "The Americans are not monsters. The war was built on lies. When it ends, we must rebuild with honesty, not hatred. We must remember that our enemies were human beings, who showed us mercy when they had every reason not to." He didn't know if the letter would reach her. Mail was unreliable, and Germany was collapsing. But it mattered that he wrote it. It mattered that he tried. Winter turned to spring. News filtering into the camp grew grimmer with each passing week. The Allies pushed from both sides. Cities fell. The Great Reich crumbled like a building with a rotten foundation. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time.